Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn session, Growing Around Grief. We're going to talk about kids and development and the way that that impacts grief. So where it says there, we're doing ages 0 to 12, which is a really big range. So we are going to break it down and have a conversation about what you might see, how grief is showing up based on a kid's developmental stage, as well as just considering development and its impact on a child's ability to understand death and the permanence that's a part of that. So we'll dive in and begin this conversation, this topic. We're going to start with just talking about some myths about grief. I just want to put those out there, I want to acknowledge them. They may be some ideas you held or still hold around the role of grief for kids or children's role in grieving practices. They also might just be ideas other people have handed you or prescriptions that come from cultural practices that maybe leave kids out of grief a little bit. So we're going to talk about that. Then we're going to just talk about the unique shape of grief for kids 0 to 12. As I said, we're going to break it down, we'll do sort of infants and toddlers, and then early childhood, 2 to 5, and then we'll move through school years. And I really value the opportunity to come and talk about it in that way, because a lot of parents come wondering, particularly in those early years, how do you support grief as it shifts and changes over time? And so we'll build off of what grief's like when there's a really early loss and how to support it. So we'll talk about that, the unique factors that shape grief, including development, and then how to help with hopefully a couple of really practical tools that you can take away as you're supporting your young person. So I want to start here. I'm going to offer you a lot of information today. I think that's the purpose of these Lunch and Learns. That's why you show up. Or if you're watching the video on our website at a later time, the Lunch and Learns purpose is just sort of brief, concrete, direct information that helps you as a parent or a caregiver support your grieving child. But I also want to remind you of this. I've used this in a couple of other Lunch and Learns, but need to acknowledge that the title of our session is borrowed from the work of Lois Tonkin, which reminds us that sometimes in our culture, and even for us personally, we might think that grief just gets smaller over time. You put it on a shelf, right? It gets so small, you hardly notice it's there. But Lois Tonkin brought forward this idea that grief it's not getting smaller over time, but that we are growing large around our grief. And when we think about grieving kids as they grow, as they move through their development, that's what's happening for them. And hopefully today's session provides some clarity on what you'll see, and also some ways of helping them to grow big around the loss that they're navigating now in their life. Let's just start here. Pay attention. As I mentioned, these may be beliefs you hold, or it might be beliefs or ideas that other people have recommended to you. And so as we go in this session, I hope that it'll become clear why I'm putting these out here as myths, as things we really want to consider whether they're true. And in fact, holding on to these ideas may make it a little bit more challenging for our child or a child to navigate grief. So right up here at the top, that they're too young to be involved or to even have the information about a death, to be involved in funeral rituals, mourning rituals, or decision-making. And so we're going to talk about that. So this is a myth that I hope we bust a little. The children are resilient. We talked about this in our last session, that resiliency is not an innate quality in kids. And sometimes we do use that and it's comforting, and some people find it hopeful, but it really is resiliency is built over time. It's built in the face of stress inside relationships that are supported, where kids are supported in a relationship with a caring person as they encounter difficulty and challenges. And so these sessions are intended, and this session's intended to equip you, as you are an important part partner even in developing your child's resiliency. It's not an innate quality. It's something that we contribute to, we help build. This idea that it's only a caregiver or a parent who should be doing the support. There are some instances where you might want to bring in someone else, for example, talking about the death. If that feels really hard for you, or you're feeling like you just need an extra support, it's okay to bring someone else in on your team or in your boat. We've talked about what it means to captain the ship for your kids in times of grief. And so it's okay to bring some crew on board that can help if this feels like a vulnerable place, or you're building your own skills here. Likewise, like I guess on the flip side, I want to say that I've often also encountered parents who feel maybe the relationship with the child's not that great, or maybe their relationship with the person who died was complicated or full of conflict. And so there can be a sense of like, oh, my child needs a neutral person, not me. And there may be some value to that a neutral person creates a space where a child's not taking care of you or being sensitive to your feelings. There can be real value in that, but it's not enough on its own. They still need you. And I think that will come clear as we talk. There's a belief that floats around out there that if there's an illness, for example, that having knowledge ahead of time that someone's going to die will make grief easier. And the phrase around that, the term around that is called anticipatory grief. So there is a belief that if you have had an opportunity to anticipate the death, that grief will be easier after the death, and that's simply not true. This next to last one fits with the top one, that the kids shouldn't be at the bedside of the dying. There may be some grieving rituals or some cultural practices that do eliminate them in some of those situations. And we want to just find and create spaces where we can include them, can offer them some sense of control over what's happening to them. When I think about even in my own life, I wasn't a child, but I was 19 when the person in my life died. And honestly, in that space of planning funerals and grieving, I never considered whether I should have a part in the funeral, but it was offered to me. And I'll always be grateful for that. And so this is, again, a place where caregivers and adults around a child captain the ship and check in and ask and see what kids want their involvement to be. So just kind of tuck those away, and we'll see if some of what I provide for you, can fill in why these are myths. Okay. Want to highlight this term, disenfranchised grief. So when you think about the myths that I just shared, what that can serve to do sometimes is create an understanding of children's grief that doesn't really recognize that they are actually grieving, doesn't openly acknowledge and validate it, and doesn't include them in decision making and practices that are part of mourning, mourning with others. And so this term has been called disenfranchised grief. And different people can be disenfranchised grievers, but in this context, we're just talking about the way that children can be considered disenfranchised. And one of the reasons the research has shown us this can be a little bit of a risk for kids or anyone who falls into this category is that when your loss is not openly acknowledged and validated, support down the road can feel like it's not quite enough. And so we want to find ways to include kids, to prepare them, to offer places of control and involvement where we can. Okay. Give you just a couple things to kind of hang on to as we move into a lot of information. You don't need to remember it all, but I highlighted this as kids' 3 big C questions to kind of hold it as a container. In one way or another, most kids are holding this wondering, and not all kids are going to have the language to articulate that, or even the recognition that this is their question. They may have a sense of unease and anxiety or worry about these things and may not even have the language. But for you to be aware that most kids are deliberating these questions in some form can help you respond to your kids and sort of captain that ship. So just to highlight these, they're on the left. When people talk about the 3s, they mean cause, catch, and care. And so I want us to think a little wider on that. I think catch implies like there's an illness they can catch, but want to think wider. So let's just say, let's talk about cause. It doesn't have to be such a literal connection, although parents are often surprised at the very creative ways that kids can attribute the death to some of their own actions. So the question is, did I cause this to happen? Did I contribute to this happening in some way? How could this happen? They're touching those big questions, and because of their developmental stage age, they often are looking at those questions through a really self-centered, kind of egocentric lens, as they're going to do in their development. But what that can look like, it can surprise adults around them who understand it's not rational or logical that they're thinking that way. And I'll give you an example. A young man, 12-year-old, who his dad had a heart attack and died, and he had been shoveling the snow prior to that. And so the boy carried this idea that if I had just gone out and shoveled like he'd asked me to, this wouldn't have happened. And so this is my fault. And so obviously a lot of self-blame and guilt, and that can become really tricky part of grief. So we're just paying attention to that, knowing that kids can make these creative leaps in ways we're not aware of. The catching is really the question of not will I catch it, but can it happen to me? Can this happen to me? And can this happen to someone else I love? And again, thinking wider than just, say, an illness. For example, the conversations around mental health can often lead kids to have this very giant, ringing, pulsing question: can this happen to me too? Obviously, illness, or there's maybe an undiscovered genetic condition that makes this actually a very valid question, and may require some interventions to support that, medical testing even, at some level, if there's actually risk in reality around that. Will this happen to me? Will this happen to me? Will this happen to someone else I love? Obviously, when a child has experienced a death in this way, the reality is they know they can lose a parent, and most kids don't have to navigate that. So can this happen to someone else that I love? Can this happen again? And then that last one, who will take care of me now? Again, I think adults sometimes don't give credit that kids are really worried about this, because you think, well, I'm still here. Who will take care of me now is a really common concern. And it's worth having a conversation about that. I would encourage you not to say nothing's going to happen to me, because kids know that's not true, that there is a possibility. And so, you can reassure them with, something like, I plan to live a really long life. I want to be, 100, sitting on my porch with my gray hair, in my rocking chair. But if something ever did happen to me, then we have, a plan, and share that plan with them. Check in on their feelings about that plan. Who would they go to? Who would look out for them if something happened to you? Okay. So those are common concerns that I see a lot. And at the CGC, I would say most kids are holding some of those in some shape, as I said. But now let's talk about the way that grief varies, and what comes in, impacts and shapes it, and creates the variation. So we've borrowed these illustrations from Oliver Jeffers' book, The Heart in the Bottle. And they're just a nice visual representation instead of me putting kind of a list there. But we have the young girl here representing just how kids show up as who they are in their own uniqueness, their personality, their gender discovery, their age, their temperament, all of these things. So there she is. And then there's these other factors, these other pieces that come in and impact how grief is going to show up. So the relationship with the person who died, the way that they died, how they're coping now, but also what were their skills for coping with distress before the death. Those are going to come into play here and shape what grief will look like. Rituals of grieving, I kind of spoke to this in the myths. What are the rituals and the practices that have helped kids find meaning, and also answered some of the questions, um, and helped them feel like they were able to contribute and be a part of remembering their person. Culture, this can be, family culture, ethnic heritage, um, the cultural values and practices that can both be anchoring for a child, and they can also be disorienting in grief, and they can come into question. But we're looking at how this impacts grief, understanding of death, all of these pieces. There at the top, you'll see primary needs come into play there. So just are those met? And really, maybe a better term is, does the child have a felt sense of predictability, of safety, and of security? And I say felt sense on purpose, that you may know they're legitimately, literally safe, but it's really a felt sense of being safe, looked after, um, that there's predictability. As humans, we're wired that creates a sense of safety. And so are those basic needs for those things being met? Other stressors, are there school challenges? Are there other health concerns? Um, other things that have been stressors even prior to the death? Have they had to move? Are there financial challenges that have come? So these pieces, and you'll see the tree there with supports, just paying attention to supportive relationships, supportive structures that are around. School can be a real source of support for some kids and then not for others. Um, and so just paying attention to what those are and maybe where some are missing. So one thing to note as we're going through this, I think a really neat piece of considering the shape of grief for your own child is not only looking at like, oof, where have the bumps been in these areas? What about these things have made their grief harder? But also, where have they been buffered by the supports that are present in these areas? One thing we know is that if there's been public attention around a death, and so maybe it's been in the news, or maybe it's you live in a small community, and there's a lot of public information and conversation that a child may not know themselves, which is problematic, but also may not want other people to know, and they've lost control of that. They don't get to decide that, it's been decided. So yeah, the public nature of the person's death. I've known clients where, because of publicity around a death, um, you know, they're asked about it in places they're not prepared for, or they don't want to talk about it. People are curious and ask questions at school, though they've said they don't want to talk about it there, and they just want to feel normal, there without that attention. Is there a history of loss? Have they lost? Is this the first kind of experience with grief and loss, or have there been a lot of losses? And paying attention to how that's shaping grief. It may be that kids feel like you and your kids feel like that you have some skills to navigate the disruption, the transition, and the emotion and the intensity, the thoughts that come with grief. And it may be that it's been compounded with loss upon loss, um, that has made that more difficult. And then lastly, I just want to highlight this communication. We're going to talk about that as we go along, but how important it is for kids to have truthful and accurate information, that's appropriate for their age, their stage of development, as they put together the pieces of the story and what's happened, and how to integrate that into their own life and experience. So the information they have, the way that it's being communicated, and not just at one time, but this ongoing conversation and communication, um, offering information both as you receive it and as they need it. So it's not uncommon that a cause of death maybe isn't determined for several months. And so there's deliberation. Do I offer my kids that information? I think they're doing okay now. And if I offer this new information, does that disrupt things? And so these are considerations that are just real that you're having to make, but we do know that kids do better when they have, accurate and appropriate information. I think we have, some other lunch and learns that really cover why that's so critical. So I'm going to leave that there with you, but we know that's a really important part of what shapes a young person's capacity to navigate grief. And then, kind of connected to that, belief system. What if family believes, and actually it doesn't really matter what that is, it's that there is a concrete story that a child can understand, just based on their development. They are not able to think abstractly. And so they need real concrete information. Where is the person now? What happens when a person dies to the body? These are really concrete things that a child needs. Okay, just want to highlight this. We have our last parent lunch and learn, which is called Grief in the Body, covers kind of this in depth, but I just want to put this here. You may not have watched Grief in My Body and attended that one, but just want to highlight grief is not a problem. Grief is a natural and healthy adaptive response to a loss, to a death, in this context. And it does, even for children, impact all of these domains. Sometimes they're tricky to see, but behaviorally, those are the ones that we often see the most. Sometimes physically we hear about those. Emotions, can show up in a way that's more obvious, but all of these other pieces, spiritually, relationally, in their thinking, this is grief lands in all of these areas. And so we just want to kind of recognize that even for children. Okay. I want to offer you, this is kind of like a boring long list, but as I was putting together the information for you today, I want to acknowledge that our next slide is going to kind of do the breakdown of the developmental stages. And, breaking it down is tricky because there's overlap and there's variation, and every child is different on a different place of the developmental curve. But if I would need a giant slide to put all of these on every stage of development. But for the most part, these are going to run through childhood and adolescent development. They're just going to look a little bit different based on, a child's age and how they're showing up in the world. But I wanted to highlight these as a lot of them are distinctions between what children experience in grief and what adults experience in grief. And then if we can hold these in our awareness, then we can recognize that children are still actively grieving, even when it looks different from what we conceptualize as adults is grief. So this top one here is doses of grief, and it's sometimes called bursts of grief. But just that idea that the grief is coming in doses, and adults tend to go in and stay in the feelings, but kids are able to move back and forth, and it's a really brilliant way of the kind of fancy word is titrating, but moving back and forth between something fun or playful or distracting and big feelings about grief. If you stop and think about it, they've had less life experience than adults navigating these big, tricky emotions. And so there's so much wisdom in them moving back and forth and building their tolerance for those emotions so that they don't feel overwhelmed. But I offer it here because sometimes, people will comment, oh, well, I don't actually think they're grieving because, when I talk to them about it, they might seem sad for a second, but then they're like off playing with their friends, or they're laughing at a funny thing in a show that they are watching. That doesn't mean they're not grieving. This is just a normal part of childhood grief, is the doses of grief. These are other pieces of these are other pieces, changes in sleep and what they want to eat. Grief lands in the body. This distress impacts every part of us. And so, of course, our body is disrupted and our sleep will be disrupted. Our what we want to eat, we might reach for more comfort foods, not for new foods. We want to reach for the familiar. And some people may sleep more. Some people may not be able to go to sleep. At times in the quiet just before bed is when big feelings emerge. Experiences during the day that have triggered grief may come forward in a way that kids and adults are more aware of. Changes in their play. So across the developmental stage, based on how they play, They may have less energy for that, but you also in young children may see something that is called death play. And so it concerns some parents, but it is a really normal part of childhood grief. Play is the language of children. So there's an event that happens and there's their experience of what's happening. And we as adults use language to bridge that, to share about and make sense of what's happened to us or what we're experiencing, what the event was. But kids don't often have that language just developmentally. And so they use play to do that. And so especially with young children, trying to make sense of it and also kind of find an element of control and the word kind of fancy words mastery in play over something they're really not able to manage in their real life or control in real life. But it is a really powerful, important way of integrating that experience. Just like when we talk about it with other people, we make sense of it in new ways, we share our distress and work to integrate the story. And kids are doing that through play. Again, these other pieces, memories or dreams might be really vivid. You might find them looking for the person who died. Changes in energy, just wanted to highlight that. Again, it may be that they have less energy, but you might see hyperactivity. And it's good just to be aware of that. Obviously, we want to think about what a kid's normal baseline is, but it may be that a kid is a bit more hyperactive. Let's use school, for example, and just paying attention to that is part of the grief picture and helping other adults in a kid's world see that as well. Separation anxiety can show up different. We're going to talk about that when we look at the developmental line there, that it will show up in different ways. Re-grieving, would like to just highlight that grief happens across a child's life and it will change and it will look different. And there are times where it will come more to the front, particularly as kids hit new developmental stages, which just means they are understanding themselves, the world, and other people, their person who died, in new ways. And they may have new questions because they have a new capacity to understand. And we want to recognize that and support that. A death might have been, 6 years ago. But as a child comes into adolescence or hits a new stage of development and understanding the permanence around death, for example, there may be some re-grieving with that new awareness. Lastly, just want to highlight on here the regressions in behavior, or when a child's coming up to a developmental milestone or they've just passed one, you may find some regression there or a delay in moving into the new milestone. They will get there, but this is an impact of the transition and the dysregulation that the system, that their bodies are experiencing. And it's the process of adjusting to this change, but you may see that regression happening. You may see a child sucking their thumb who you're like, whoa, you're way beyond that, or needing to sleep with you, or bedwetting, or a little child who's just walked may stop walking for a little bit. These are normal responses for kids in grief. Okay, so I'm giving this slide to you in doses, speaking of grieving in doses, because this slide's really full. But this is the spot where I just wanted to break it down for you. So I just broke this down for infants and toddlers. At times, I think that this can be a group that can be really disenfranchised, because a lot of times people are like, oh, they don't even remember them and they didn't really know them. But I want to highlight that they are still impacted by the loss. And sometimes I share about this idea that we have explicit memories and implicit memories. And explicit memories, I think, are what we mostly think of as memories, which is this story or this picture that runs in our head about a time with a person or a situation. But implicit memories are more in our senses, and a sense and a feel of the person and the connection that is there. That's not a concrete, visual, if you will, explicit memory. And, infants and toddlers still have that. And sometimes what we might bring them into as they get older is drawing on that sense of their person. And that's something I say when people ask about how to support grief across development when the loss has been very early. Sometimes what it looks like is helping construct an image of their person. through stories and through sharing memories and qualities and who the person was, because no, they don't have that explicit image or memory, but we do help them create that. And because, when they're, as you'll see, when they're kind of coming up in 3 to 5 and 7, they're very concrete thinkers. And so they may need a little bit of that to grab onto. You can see there that list, increased crying and irritability. They may need to be held more, which can be difficult if you yourself are grieving and overwhelmed or dysregulated and or feeling shut down and needing a break. They may look for the person who's died. In this stage, I think the distress from caregiver is really obvious. Distress that's separating from a caregiver can be really obvious. They protest through crying, and being around strangers can be difficult. And again, just highlighting, because they are moving through development quite quickly, and those milestones are happening a lot in these ages, that you may see some regression in those things. And, want to acknowledge, as I was just saying, that though at this stage, they cannot grasp that death is permanent, right? That there's the absence of the person. It doesn't mean that they're not experiencing the distress in their system that comes from the absence of the person, because they are. And how do we help? So the routines that I spoke about before, just making sure there's predictability and rhythms and routines that can be counted on, that allow our bodies, our systems, our stress to shift into soothing, comfort, bringing us back to a place of equilibrium. Infants need this too inside their system that's running automatically for them. And so trying to stick to routines as much as we can, offering extra comfort and soothing. Sometimes those are blankets, and those are soothers, or those are, loveys, or and then they might be snuggles too. But paying attention to what is soothing for your little one, and offering a little extra of that, keeping them close and minimizing sort of the dependence on strangers, keeping them close to caregivers, because they have lost often a caregiver or an important kind of attachment or relationship connection in their world, and they don't have language for that. Obviously, you can't explain that. And so just keeping them close and providing that consistency. Okay, 2 to 5. So this is still before school. But there is some shifting here. And I want to acknowledge that you may hear more about physical complaints in this age, because often language is developing as well. But the ability to articulate that it's grief, or what they're actually feeling or needing or noticing, that may still be minimal. I wanted just to highlight the repetitive questions about the person who died or the death. This can be exhausting and also confusing for parents sometimes. Like, am I not explaining it well enough? Because they keep asking. And I've heard parents say things like, how many times are we going to have to do this? How many times am I going to have to answer this brutal question even, right? And the child is, it's not that they don't understand. This is a normal way that they're processing and integrating what's happened, making sense of it. Sometimes it's kind of that sense of reality testing, but also just hearing the story. The repetitive questions help them integrate the story based on their cognitive capacity, which, as I said here in the box down below, that at this age between 2 and 5, death is really still understood as temporary. It's reversible. So you may hear kids talk about going to visit their person or bringing their person back, or that the person who died will attend their birthday party or something like that, because this is their understanding developmentally of death. They are often beginning to shift into an understanding of the difference between dead and alive, based on what they're observing in the world around them through plants and animals. And this is a good entry point to talk about death with them. And we want to use really clear, concrete language. Again, not abstract words or ideas. We want to talk about what happens when people die. This is how kids are understanding it and making sense of it. That the heart stops beating and the lungs stop breathing and there's no pain. They don't feel pain. It's okay to offer, the story in line with your beliefs about what happens after a person has died. Kids are, as I said a few times, concrete thinkers. And so they do need to locate the person in time and space. So where are they now? And there are times where you may have answered this question a few times and they've sort of forgotten it, or they didn't take it in when you offered it. I have had families where maybe the person was cremated and the family has had the conversation with the young person, but a year later, they'll say to me, my mom won't let me go to my dad's graveside and see where they're buried. So at the time that information was offered, they weren't able to integrate that. So you might have to have these, again, in ongoing ways, these conversations. Another forgetting, the worry about forgetting and grief is, I think, across ages. But sometimes at this age, because of their stage of development, they do actually kind of forget for a time, and they're playing or they're doing something else. And then when they come back to remember, there may be feelings of guilt around that. Acknowledge there will be more meltdowns. There will be dysregulation. There will be more meltdowns. And these are challenging, obviously. And part of that is the lack of language and being able to understand the big emotions and sensations that are coming up for them that can feel distressing. Magical thinking is a part of this stage, and also go into the next stage as well. Back to that idea of not understanding that death is temporary, and that the person can't come back. And some of the magical thinking, even in thinking that they have caused what's happened. You can see that there, you'll still see that distress often at separation from important caregivers and people in their world. And they may be able to, there will be increased awareness of worry, or maybe that sense of worry about other people, and maybe even the ability to articulate it. They may have experiences of the person who died around them. So that can happen a bit more at this age. So again, what helps? It's really going to be a through line of what helps. You're going to hear the theme, and we're going to capture that here at the end. But they do build on each other. So now we're listening to what they have to say a bit more, and we're responding. Our listening and responding looks different for an infant, right? Because we're just picking up the cues. Here, we're still doing that. We're still building off of that, recognizing that they don't have the capacity, 2 to 5 year olds, to articulate their needs probably skillfully, or even have full awareness of that. And so we're paying attention, we're listening to those cues, words and actions, behavior, and responding with patience. In particular, those repetitive questions, as I mentioned, they get old. You kind of wonder, like, what is going on? Sometimes they're triggering questions for you, but responding with patience, with that accurate information, truthful information, age appropriate for this age, concrete. And then the routines, it continues throughout this whole page. This will continue to be a theme that provides that sense of security, and finding ways for comfort and soothing that fit with your child's personality, and also kind of, this age and stage. So, for a 2 to 5 year old, the way you're going to provide comfort and soothing is going to look really different than your 14-year-old who may not want to snuggle. They may want to snuggle up on the couch, but they may not want to do that. And you may just have to be in the same room, across the couch from each other, and offering your presence, your comfort, your soothing in that way. Okay, let's just look at this 6 to 8. How it can kind of show up different. Kids are going to school at this age, so their world is opening up in a different way. And I wrote school refusal here because this separation anxiety can show up as school refusal, which gets stressful for parents and kids, and a little bit confusing. So just offering that, so that if that's the situation you're in, or you're noticing this for your child, this is grief related. Offering this session also, one of our previous lunch and learns we did is called What's Grief and What's Not? But it's really addressing the $1 million question that parents are always asking, which is like, what's grief and what's bad behavior? So we've addressed how to support that and kind of answered that question. But I hope in this session, what you're hearing is things that sometimes can look just like bad behavior do still have grief as part of that story. So school refusal can look like just really bad behavior, but it can also be linked to the fears of being separated from you, or from their place, their zone where they feel safe. There may be more specific questions about the death or burial or cremation. And again, it may be worth reminding. So 2 to 5 can also sometimes have these questions, but here you may need to do a little more around reassuring that when people die, they don't feel pain. There may be questions, I think it says there developmentally for them of they might worry that their person is cold in if they've been buried, or they're lonely, or they might be scared. Sometimes the idea of cremation is scary, terrifying for kids, or gross, but the idea of their person being burned. So you have to have these literal conversations around, when a person dies, this is what happens to the body, and they don't feel pain. Um, so those can be important here. Again, the way the grief might show up physically here, you might hear more active complaining around stomach aches or headaches, and there's really an actual, just really physiological reason for that. That what our body produces in times of stress to try to get us toward action and safety, and into the side of our nervous system that can feel soothed and comforted and relaxed and calm. The things that our body, the neurochemicals and hormones that our body produces for that, are actually largely produced in our gut, which is interesting. It's like 70 something percent. And so it's not surprising to me that when kids are really worried, or when kids are really stressed, that they have stomach aches. And sometimes as parents, we dismiss that, but it can actually be linked. So that stress, or overwhelming feelings or thoughts around the loss may lead to some of these complaints, feeling more guilty, responsible for the death. And then this other piece, because they're moving into the realm of peers and school, and they're becoming more aware of families different from their own, that happens normally. And then where there's a death in a family, there may be some embarrassment, or just extra awareness or sensitivity to feeling different from their peers because of the change in their family or the loss. And as it says down there, they are beginning to have a growing understanding that death is permanent. But again, this line between these two, or all these zones, really is more fluid than these boxes might kind of lead you to believe. So again, we're building off of routine and comfort and soothing and listening and paying attention, but being patient with repetitive questions that may continue, or questions that are hard to answer. And it's also okay to say, like, I don't know right now. Can I get back to you? Can I get back to you on that? Again, that accurate information, the information kids need over time, is going to change based on what their development is. And that reassurance, not only when you think back to the 3C questions, so reassurance about who will take care of them and that they are safe, and those pieces, but also normalizing, reassuring them that what their experience is normal in grief. It's hard, and it can feel scary, but that there's nothing wrong with the way that they're grieving, that these are the things coming up, and that grief, as I said, is a healthy response to the loss of a person in your life. So this last one, 9 to 12, again, so much fluidity, movement between them, variation. But in this upper elementary, 9 to 12, you might find that kids hide their emotions more, maybe to fit in, or maybe not to cause worry. They don't want to worry you or other people who care about them, because now the school load is probably requiring a little bit more focus. And if they're distracted and having troubles with that, it's going to be more obvious. So that may be coming forward more. It's probably still happening in those earlier stages, but just based on what the requirement that they're experiencing in their lives with school, more obvious. They may take on roles or responsibilities. If they've lost a parent, they may feel like they're supposed to fill in the gap. You may also want them to at times without knowing it. And so these are things to pay attention to. Roles do change when someone in a family has died. And I have seen this become, especially, 11, 12, 13, very heavy for kids, because they may feel they're supposed to fill the role of a parent, and they don't have the capacity to do that, the skills to do that. And so we want to pay attention to that. Again, just that feeling responsible, and the way that guilt or self-blame may be showing up for them, or they may be hanging on to that. It might be a heavy weight. And that heightened sense that I am different from the people around me. It is rare that a kid will know another person their age who's had a similar loss. And so there can be some real value in that. When I have kids who are like, yeah, no, there's a girl in my class, her dad died, or her brother died, or something like that. There can be some comfort in that for some kids. So At this point, there's been a shift to understanding that death is permanent has, is pretty much there. And those questions about, those literal questions may sort of begin to shift into those bigger, more existential questions around what happens to a person's spirit after they die, or they might begin to worry in a different way about their own death or consider that in a different way. Again, I'm feeling a little like a broken record, but yeah, what helps? I want to highlight that here. Just recognizing that the conversation you're going to have with your 5-year-old is not the conversation you're going to have with your 11-year-old. And so, I think that for parents of grieving kids, this is like a heavy weight, that this isn't just one and done, or you get your kids through the first, year or two, though that matters. You build a framework for that, you build the foundation for that, for this integration to happen. But there are going to be times over their development where you're going to have to revisit it. And these are going to look like ongoing conversations to give them the information they need and address the new questions that are arising. Again, that accurate info. I put here to start asking what they need. I've talked a couple times about captaining the ship, and as kids get older, we want to teach them to captain their ship too. And so we're co-captains of the ship. And so not just assuming that we know what they need, but checking in and asking. And we might still need to offer options and ideas, which is why you come to something like this. But to begin to ask, what is it you need? Where do you need me to advocate? Do you have this? Do you feel like you got this issue at school, or do you want me to talk to your teacher? So checking in on those things. Do you want me to provide that information for your teacher to give to the class so that you don't have to do it? Maybe these decisions they are really included in as they start to get older. Normalizing, as I've said throughout, and also, preparing them. And I even would do this with kids a little bit younger, even in possibly the 6 to 8, 9 to 12, preparing them for what they might encounter, what they can expect from other people, from certain situations, and just finding new ways of connection that provide comfort and soothing and normalcy, predictability. I think I might have said comfort, soothing, all of those things in this stage, but that are fitting, for who they are at this time in their development. And there's my arrow, just to say, like, there's so much movement. Some kids, as I said, can be on the back of the curve. Some kids are, front of the curve. They're really, really sort of mature. We want to pay attention to this because biological age is not always developmental age. And so if you've noticed that you have a kid who, may act, somewhere on this line that maybe doesn't match their age, that's where you want to respond, right? You want to respond to their sort of developmental age and skills versus their chronological age that you think, gosh, they're 12, they shouldn't be doing that. Well, they may, be a little bit on the back of the curve, or they might have had some regression. So you want to think about how to respond as if you're responding to that developmental age. I'm going to leave this here, but I just wanted to highlight, we're going to talk about this in the next slide, but just how to help. We have a really great lunch and learn that our director, Nadine Gary-P. Fisk, did about how to talk to kids about grief and death. And she kind of highlights these 3 areas of communicating, connecting, and comfort. And I've been hitting those all along in the previous slide. But if you're like, okay, I got it, I'm supposed to do that. How do I do that really skillfully? This lunch and learn, which is available on the website for free. You can just check that out. And she does a great job of giving handles to that, resources to that, language to that, if you're like, how do I do that? So just in summary, we want to ask and invite our kids. These are ways we're helping. We're going to captain the ship, and we're also going to invite them, preparing them for what to expect, finding ways to normalize it, offering, sometimes it might even look like saying, I've read, or I've heard that other kids sometimes, worry that someone else in their life might die after, like dad has died. I've heard that other kids have a worry like that when they've had a death. Is that something that you've been wondering or worrying about? Finding ways to normalize it, even in an offering like that. And that example I just gave you created a little distance. It's not like, do you worry that that someone else might die? It's like, I've heard other kids worry about this. I wonder if this is something that you worry about. So the information I gave you on the developmental slide could come in handy that way. I gave you a really common list. And so it's a really kind of like non-invasive way and a little bit of an indirect way to begin a check-in and be able to normalize for your kids. Rhythms and routines probably can't hit that hard enough of how that creates that sense of security and safety and stable ground as they're navigating the changing world and the changes inside themselves. And that sometimes we need the information that I've provided here today to advocate with other family members or the school, other people who are, love our child or caring for our child. So, you want to be able to advocate when they need you to. Before we're done, just want to close up with a couple of these things. Okay, so, where can you start now? How can you begin to invite your child to share about their grief with you? Offer some of those normalizing pieces. So I wrote here that stories can help children, help us even adults, find language for our grief. So if you remember when I said that play is children's language, and oftentimes they might lack the language to describe an experience or even the cognitive capacity to be able to totally make those connections. Sometimes stories are a beautiful part of that bridge that gives us language. And the important part about that, when we can find language or a way to express our experience, is that idea that when we can share it with someone else, it becomes a little easier to bear. And so obviously you want to invite your kids to do that with you. So stories are a great way to do that. Here's some of my favorites. There's some other ones. My Big Dumb Invisible Dragon by Sounds True. They have a book, but they also, if you want to Google that on YouTube, they have a really great virtual version of that book and an activity guide that can open the conversation between you and your kids. And stories can also be a good entry point if you're kind of feeling like, I don't really know, or it overwhelms me. The book can be this sort of neutral meeting place, and you can have a conversation about that. I'm going to give you just a couple of tools, but that one over down here on the right-hand side, In My Heart, it's a book about feelings. It's not specifically about grief, but I think in this conversation, you can imagine how having some language around emotions can be helpful. Grief's not just the feelings that we have, it's thoughts and it's the way that it shows up in our behavior and our feelings. And so, getting some language around that can be really, really helpful. So I love that book for that. And it can be fun. You can have a big bowl of beads, buy some beads from the dollar store or Walmart. And, you can make a bracelet with the colors of the emotions that are listed in the book. And then I also love to say, oh, let's make our own. The book didn't have one that I feel a lot. So, maybe I feel tired a lot, and that one's not in there. So I'm going to pick a bead for, green bead for tired, or maybe I think the book actually has guilty, which is kind of cool. But anyway, you can expand off of it. And I like it because it's not grief focused, but it is a really good way to be able to support your child in grief. So if you have a child who's reluctant to talk about grief, we're really starting with helping them kind of bridge, right, to get an understanding of what it is they're experiencing. So anyway, here's some great ones. Want to offer you this just on a few of the pieces that parents talk a lot about. And I just shared a way to find fun ways to invite your kids to notice and share, their feelings or their experience of grief. And so that's a favorite of mine there. That's those little emoji sticks are from my office. I just bought those colorful popsicle sticks from the dollar store and got some great emoji stickers. And when kids come into a session, I can just be like, hey, will you check in with me today? Let me know how your day's been and how you're coming into our time. And so as a parent, you just might want to have these available, and you'll need to maybe lead this by doing and showing them. And this can be a really, again, important part of that bridge that helps them share with you and also helps them kind of begin to know what to do when these big feelings begin. Got to be able to sort of name them first. Name it to tame it is a phrase that's used a lot. I put the worry jar here that, if there's a lot of worries happening, this can be helpful. You create it in any way. Your family could have a worry jar, a child could have a worry jar. It can be the place where these things are held. so you don't have to carry them around all the time. Sometimes they're heavy. Sometimes they spin around in your head, a lot when you're at school and you can't think about anything else, or when you're trying to go to sleep. And so a worry jar might be a helpful thing. You can write it and put it in there. You could draw it and put it in there. I could write, I could write it for you if you want to tell me and put it in there. And sometimes you might see, and then I could check in with you and see if you want to come back. We can see if this worry has gotten bigger or smaller, or if there's some things we need to do to help this worry change. So that can be a really helpful tool. I like a mishmash of these two as well, where you can have something called a mixed up feelings jar. And so you may have a jar and emoji stickers or some print offs or something kind of fun, colors like paint chip colors or anything, where you throw them in there when you have them, these emotions, these big emotions that are sometimes confusing and tricky. I love it because it says, we can feel a lot of things at one time, and sometimes it's all mixed up and it's hard to sort out. So you can be happy and sad at the same time. You can feel guilty and relieved, and we can feel all of these things at the same time. And but sometimes it gets really full, and maybe too full that it overflows. So those are some kind of fun ways to do that. You'd have to lead the way, model. A lot of us probably didn't get that modeling, and so this is part of equipping kids. I put share memories. That might be verbal. You might be sharing stories, as I shared for, infants or toddlers that have had a loss at that stage. As they get older, you may need to share stories to help them create the image of the person that can match the sensation. But you also may want to do that in a really concrete way, like a memory box. I think one of the books there is called The Memory Box, a book about grief. It's a really good story about a girl who creates a memory box. And they can gather special items, they can decorate it in a way they love or that their person would love. Sometimes kids collage it, paint it, put pictures on it. There's no wrong way to do it, right? They can do it however they'd like. And you might have sometimes I put a little battery operated candle in there. And it's like it's special to open it and to turn on the candle and remember your person. It also lets them feel like in charge of that. Like, I'm not dependent on adults in my world to help me remember, or connect to items, because sometimes there's these items that are connected to their person that we're afraid they'll lose when they're kids, like maybe there's a necklace or a piece of jewelry or a phone. I've seen that, like an iPhone, or a beautiful creation, or just some really valuable thing that was their person's you hope to pass on to them. And those aren't always accessible, but having something accessible, they have control over it, they can get to. And lastly, I put there around supporting sleep. And so I don't know too many people who don't have their sleep disrupted. Some may sleep more. Some may, as I've said already, may find it hard to fall asleep. And so I'm just supporting this. Not, we don't have to get like worried about it, but just paying attention to it, because our body needs sleep to heal. And so routine's a big part of that. I'm sure if you Google sleep hygiene, probably we need a future lunch and learn on that. But just that predictability and the routine, what they can expect, so their bodies can begin to settle. You may find that's a time when more grief conversations come up. Lots of parents say that, and you're exhausted at the end of the day, so that can be extra tough. A worry jar can come in handy there. There's some other ideas there. Extra stuffed animals, a worry doll, worry jar, a pillowcase that belong to their person or has been made from clothes of their person. I've seen so many creative ideas. Safe place kind of visualizations, right? Imagining a place that feels safe and fun. And then I also put there, some kids need to fall asleep to music. And there's so many great apps out there now. Calm's one that I love, that I've used, where there's kids specific to stories for sleep, to help them do that. And just normalizing that this is happening, that it's okay. They may need to sleep with you, and you get to decide if that's what you want to do and how you want to support them. You may just need that closeness. Yeah, but just finding creative ways to invite your child to share about what's going on for them. Okay, just this last reminder as I close up here, to say that I think particularly for kids, but grief in general, we have this idea, and other people have this idea, that this is the way grief goes, that it starts large and that it just progressively shifts into become smaller and more manageable, and that there's not like an ebb and flow of that. And so I know if you're a griever, that's not true. But just this reminder, I hope it's connected to all the things I've shared, even just the different stages of development. Grief may look larger than you imagined it ever would 5 years after a loss. And so grief ebbs and flows. It gets, it does change over time. But be assured that all of these ways you're supporting your kids now are helping them grow large around the loss.